As time ticks down, the races are heating up.
Yeah, nearly 3 million votes have already been cast here in North Carolina, a major jump from the same time just 4 years ago.
And here to talk about where we stand is political reporter from The Hill, Julia Manchester. Good morning, Julia.
Hey, good morning, guys. Thanks for having me.
Julia, can we first of all talk about early voting? We've seen the numbers increase a lot of places, especially in battleground states. Is that something that these candidates are looking to, and how do they feel about that?
Yeah, look, early voting, particularly in North Carolina and Georgia, has rocketed even more than 2020. And I think there's a number of different factors at play. Look, we've seen both parties really talk about the convenience of early voting and making a plan to vote. Look, on election day, voting can, sort of be up in the air. I mean, voters could decide to stay home for a number of reasons, including the weather, for example. So you have candidates really pushing, voters to get out there early. And it's also a bit different from 2020 because during 2020, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, you heard former President Trump, essentially spreading unfounded conspiracy theories about early voting and vote by mail. But 4 years later, he and Republicans have really embraced the practice and have encouraged their supporters and their voters to take part in it. So it's unclear really who early voting necessarily benefits. We know that historically it has benefited Democrats, but this year it could be a little different. Experts I talked to say that it likely gives Democrats a bit of an edge. However, Republicans certainly trying to get in there and cast their ballots early as well.
Julia, some of the big news over the weekend, what happened at Donald Trump's rally there at Madison Square Garden with comedian Tony Hinchcliffe. We know that Harris has struggled with young men of color, particularly Latinos. We know 44% compared to, according to a Gen Forward survey, 44% of Latino men back Donald Trump. But could something like what happened over the weekend, we're seeing Bad Bunny come out in support of Harris, could that sway some of these people over to the Democrats?
It's unclear. We know that, at the least, this has created a distraction for Republicans when they would rather be talking about high prices, the immigration, inflation, the economy, et cetera. Those are issues that seem to have, moved a lot of these young men of color towards the Trump campaign. Now, I want to emphasize the Trump campaign has not been winning a majority of men of color. Harris still leads with the group, but he has been getting enough of them in the polls where it could pose a significant problem to Harris. I think the issue with Tony Hinchcliffe's comments, or the issue at play here is he made them about, obviously Puerto Rican voters. And that is obviously one part of the Hispanic Latino voting bloc. This is a voting bloc, and I would say this about any voting bloc, but it is not a monolith. You have Puerto Ricans who vote very different than Cubans, for example, or Mexican Americans or Venezuelan Americans. And we know that Puerto Ricans historically have voted more to the left. They do tend to vote more liberally, but Trump was certainly trying to make inroads with them as well as he was with the entire Hispanic voting bloc. So maybe it does definitely stop some of his momentum with that group. But guys, at the end of the day, this is an election that is going to come down to the margins. You have these campaigns targeting various different groups, men of color, in places like Philadelphia, like Charlotte, in many of these swing states. You even have, for example, out west, both campaigns targeting Mormons, not because they think they're going to necessarily win a majority of these votes or these voters, but they know that if they peel off a certain number of these voters, that could impact their margins in those states. And for Puerto Ricans in particular, there is a large population of them in the greater Philadelphia area in Pennsylvania. So if Democratic turnout in Philadelphia is sky high, that could give Kamala Harris an edge over Donald Trump in Pennsylvania, which has the most electoral college votes out of all of the 7 battleground states.
And Julia, we talk about that with them targeting those certain areas. I know Donald Trump's going to be in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is a huge county over there. How do the candidates either flip someone to their side or maintain that base? I know that Lehigh County is one of those areas that Trump could actually flip over there.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of questions as to how they do it this late in the game. I mean, a lot of pollsters would say that most voters, even though they say they're undecided, they might be leaning one way or another. But it all comes down to their closing arguments, and you're going to see those closing arguments, start to take shape this week. Kamala Harris will be speaking just down the street from me here in Washington at the Ellipse. That was obviously the place on the National Mall by the White House that Donald Trump spoke on January 6th. That will be her closing argument speech. She will also be traveling to a number of swing states. On top of that, you had former President Trump giving his closing arguments at Madison Square Garden. But, I think the remarks at Madison Square Garden sort of underscore how important these closing arguments are, because even though Donald Trump was able to give this address, give these remarks in New York City and got a lot of attention, he's been overshadowed by these, racist and controversial remarks by Tony Hinchcliffe. So it kind of gives you a sense of how high the stakes are for both of these campaigns.